everyone. I am Wafa. I am a student of history at NYU. And today's session is a celebration of Meer Taqi Meer, who was born 300 years ago. So this is the third centenary of his birth. And I am here with Professor Tahira Naqvi, who is a clinical professor of Urdu Language and Literature at NYU. She's a translator, writer, a painter, a great teacher. She's published translations of a lot of progressive Urdu writers, including Ismat Chagtai, Manto, Khadija Mastoor, and Hajra Masroor. She's the author of 2 collections of short stories, including Attar of Roses and Other Stories of Pakistan, as well as Dying in a Strange Country. Her first novel is forthcoming, and it talks about the blasphemy laws in Pakistan. It's called The History Teacher, and will be published this year by Speaking Tiger Books. Thank you so much, Professor Naqvi, for joining us in this conversation about Meer Taqi Meer. He is seen on par with Ghalib by a lot of literary scholars. He is someone whose influence is still seen on poetry, music, even colloquially. There's a lot of things that we have picked up on without realizing that we're quoting Meer. So let's begin with his life. Why is he so important? Why celebrate Meer today?
Thank you, Wafa. Also, there's a disclaimer. I am a student of Meer Taqi Meer, and by no means a scholar nor an expert. So I'm studying and learning about him as we go along. So please excuse any, problems that you foresee. I'm sure there are a lot of Urdu walas here. Meer Taqi Meer, first of all, was born in 1723, and he died in Lucknow in September 1810. So we all are familiar with some of his ghazals, and I think the most popular ones that have been sung are the ones that we remember very well. For example, Patta Patta, Boota Boota, Haal Hamara Jane Hai, and Ye Dhuan Sa Kahan Se Utta Hai. So these have been popularized, but who really is Meer Taqi Meer, and why is it that we know Ghalib so well, but we don't know so much about him? So going back to the question of why Meer, let me read a couple of things that Ghalib says about him. Ghalib was very young when Meer passed away. So in the words of Ghalib, Ghalib apna ye aqeeda hai baqaul nasikh, aap be-behra hai jo mu'taqid Meer nahi. Ghalib, it is our belief that according to Nasikh, he is ignorant who is not a believer in Meer. Then Ghalib says, Rekhte ki tumhi ustad nahi Ghalib, kehte hain agle zamane mein koi Meer bhi tha. You are not the only master of Urdu, Ghalib. They say that in the past there also used to be a Meer. And मीर के शेर का अहवाल क्या कहूँ गालिब, जिसका दीवान कमज़ गुलशने कश्मीर नहीं. What can I say about Meer's poetry, Ghalib, whose divan is no less than the garden of Kashmir? So this is what Ghalib has to say about him. And then we go on to a little bit. I'm going to just talk very briefly about his times. We refer to him as a great poet of the Mughal period, but by the time that he became a poet and he was older, the empire was crumbling, as we know, and the terrible sack of Delhi occurred. And Meer describes these events. It's interesting that he is one of the only postmodern poets who ever wrote an autobiography. And it was called Zikr Meer. And one expects that in that autobiography he would have personal accounts of his own life, But the book is primarily an account of the times in which he lived. And so it's a kind of a political document, almost a historical document of the times. And it's called Zikr-e Meer. But as Shamsur Rahman Farooqi writes, Meer's life from 1741 to 1782 was one of great literary success. People generally believe that he was a dour, sad, unhappy person, a sad, unhappy poet. And generally, when we read selections of Meer in various collections, we come across that image very frequently. Anyway, so in 1811, his Kulliyat, the entire collection, was published by the College of Fort William. And according to Farooqi, perhaps the final seal of authority on his position as the major poet of that time was set. So that's a little bit about, you know, the times in which he lived. There was times of great turmoil, you know, historically speaking, and the empire was just more or less ending. The British were taking over. So it was a very difficult time for Meer.
So these were turbulent times, but if you go through his poetry, you really see that he's experimenting with a lot of things. He's one of the poets who's lauded for the ease with which he writes. He's very easy to understand for someone who's just beginning to read Urdu literature as well. If you are a student of Meer, I'm the student of a student. And in the last week or so that I have just started reading his poetry, I've been really impressed with the vastness of the subject matter. So can you talk about his style a bit more? What were themes that he was really taken by, apart from the politics of the time?
So let me first say a few words about what the work consisted of. So he composed 6 divans in Urdu. He also wrote a Tazkira, which is a biographical dictionary of Urdu poems, titled Nikatul Shuara. He composed in Persian a book of stories about the Sufis titled Faiz-e Meer, and he also compiled a divan in Persian. An eminent Pakistani scholar, Ahmed Javed, places Meer alongside the Persian poet Hafiz in terms of the breadth, versatility, and artistry of language and form. Meer also wrote the Masnavi, Shola-e-Ishq or Shola-e-Ishq. Some scholars consider Meer's Masnavi's long narrative poems in Muamalat-e-Ishq and Khab-u Khayal-e Meer, written in the first person, to have been inspired by Meer's own early love affairs. But there's no real proof that these accounts of a poet's passionate love affair and descent into madness are autobiographical. But a great deal is made of it, and again and again critics will refer to these and present them as proof that he was indeed a very sad and miserable person and quite mad at the end of his life. Meer's 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th collections of Urdu poetry were put together between the years 1785 and 1808. In all, he composed 1,916 ghazals. So the volume of the work and the expansive nature of his work is such that it is impossible for any one of us to just sit there one fine morning and say, well, I'm going to finish all of Meer today or in a lifetime. So generally what has happened is that people tend to make selections of his work. And as they do that, as those selections are made, of course, that depends a great deal upon the personal inclinations and, interests of the person who's doing it. And in the past, and even now, people are very, very eager to think about Meer, to write about him, to look at his work. But then what they're looking at are mere in mere piecemeal, and in bits and pieces. And so I think we need to put all of those various ideas that critics have about him and people have about him and because we can't do a complete picture of Meer. So I'm going to just go over a few things that you were asking about. How many Meers are there? So there is this Meer who was lamenting the loss of his city, Delhi, and the change that had come over his country. He felt as if he was inhabiting a different world, and everything that was good and worthwhile was slipping away. And a sense of loss and despair does reveal itself in his poetry. इस अहद को न जानिए अगला सा अहद मीर, वो दौर अब नहीं, ज़मी आसमां नहीं. Don't consider this era to be one like the era of old. That age is not here anymore, nor the same sky or earth. जिस जा खसो खार के अब ढेर लगे हैं, जिस जा खसो खार के अब ढेर लगे हैं, या हमने इन्हीं आँखों से देखे हैं बहारें, या हमने इन्हीं आँखों से देखी हैं बहारें. Where there are piles of sticks and thorns, here with these very eyes we have seen many a springtime. रस्म उठ गई दुनिया से एक बार मुरव्वत की, रस्म उठ गई दुनिया से एक बार मुरव्वत की, क्या लोग ज़मीं पर हैं, कैसा ये समा आया. And then, of course, filled with a poignant lament, heartbreaking in its sorrowful tone, is this elegy to Delhi. क्या बूदोबाश पूछो हो पूरब के साकिनों, क्या बूदोबाश पूछो हो पूरब के साकिनों, हमको गरीब जान के हंस हंस पुकार के. दिल्ली जो एक शहर था आलम में इंतखाब, रहते थे मुंतखिब ही जहाँ रोजगार के, जिसको फलक ने लूट कर वीरान कर दिया, जिसको फलक ने लूट कर वीरान कर दिया, हम रहने वाले उसी उजड़े दयार के. So this is one Meer. Then you see a poet who reveals seriousness, self-confident, some places a voice that is glib, shrewd, guileful, a lover, playful, passionate. Suddenly there is no sign of the weeping, helpless, despairing, whining Meer. दिल की कुछ कदर करते रहियो तुम, ये हमारा भी नाज़ परवर है. छोड़ जाते हैं दिल को तेरे पास, ये हमारा निशान है प्यारे. मीर अंधन भी कोई मरता है, जान है तो जहां है प्यारे. माशूकों की गर्मी ए मीर क़यामत है, माशूकों की गर्मी ए मीर क़यामत है, छाती में यूं गले लगकर तुक आग लगा देंगे. The heat of the beloved is like doomsday, Meer. She will cling to my breast as if to light it on fire. So then, now we see Meer the lover. He creates moods that move from separation to union, from waiting to playfulness and passion. The lover and the beloved become complicated beings, and one cannot easily and always fit them into the traditional tropes of that time. मीर खिलाफ़ मिजाज मोहब्बत मूजिब तलखी कुशीदन है, यार मुआफ़िक़ मिल जाए तो लुत्फ़ है, चाह मज़ा है इश्क़. Meer at odds with one's temperament is cause for bitter tension. If you find a suitable beloved, then affection is enjoyable, love delightful. So then we move on from his poetry in which he is the ma'shuq and he talks about the beloved to what we know as Meer's sexual poetry. And it has been variously described as lowly and vulgar by critics. They love Meer, People love Meer, but they cherry pick his verses that present him as a poet of sorrow, claiming that lightheartedness and gaiety were not allowed in Meer's portion, and that his shares all reflect grief and affliction, failure and despair. We love Meer when he is like that. But here are couplets that move the reader into another realm. बीड़े खाता है तो आता है नजर पान का रंग, किस कदर हाय रूह जिल्द गुलू नाजुक है. When she chews the beetle leaf, one can see the color of the pan. How delicate it is, the appearance of the skin of the neck. क्या लुत्फ तन छुपा है, क्या लुत्फ तन छुपा है मेरे तंग पोश का, क्या लुत्फ तंग छुपा है मेरे तंग पोश का, उगला पड़ा है जामे से उसका बदन तमाम. How delightful hidden is the body of my beloved in her close-fitting garment. Her body, all of it, swells out of the garment. शब नहाता था जो वो रश्क कमर पानी में, शब नहाता था वो जो रश्क कमर पानी में, गुत्थी महताब से उठती थी लहर पानी में, गुत्थी महताब से उठती थी लहर पानी में. When the envy of the moon bathed in the water, like a moon arose a turbulent wave in the water. उठती है मौज हर एक आगोश की सूरत, उठती है मौज हर एक आगोश की सूरत, दरिया को है किसका बोसो किनार ख्वाहिश. Then finally there is the Meer, grappling with duality of purpose, the complexities and contradictions of the universe. A metaphysical overture pulls the reader into yet another directions. जाए गैरत है खाक दाने जहां, जाए गैरत है खाक दाने जहां, तू कहां सर उठाए जाता है. It's beautiful, isn't it? This world, a dust pit, is a place of shame for me. Where do you go with your head raised? And then, देख सैलाब इस बयाबां का, देख सैलाब इस बयाबां का, कैसा सर को झुकाए जाता है. Look at the flood of this desert, how you go with your head bowed. किन नींदों को तू सोती है अब चश्म, किन नींदों को तू सोती है अब चश्म, मिशगां तो खोल शहर को सैलाब ले गया. मवाज आब सा है वलेकिन उड़े है खाक, है मीर बहरे तहे हस्ती सराब की सा है. जाए का नहीं शोर. And then of course so these are just, you know, a few couplets from longer ghazals, of course, and you know, you can just take one particular couplet and spend hours and perhaps sometimes days trying to understand and explain what Meer actually means by them. And finally, we hear in Meer's voice a tumultuous noise, a kind of confidence. And he says, जाने का नहीं शोर सुखन का मेरे हरगिज़, ता हश्र जहां में मेरा दीवान रहेगा. So you notice how the voice changes from the first reference that I made to this particular Meer. जहां से देखिए एक शेर शोर अंगेज निकले है, जहां से देखिए एक शेर शोर अंगेज निकले है, क़यामत का सहंगामा है हर जा मेरे दीवान में, क़यामत का सहंगामा है हर जा मेरे दीवान में. So these are some of the different ways in which we approach Meer. And that is not to say that there are not other ways that you can also approach him, but this is just a kind of a summarized version of how we may look at Meer, and how as we open the divan we do not restrict ourselves to just one particular aspect of his work, but try to look for these various kinds of characteristics that are there.
Thanks so much. Thank you for pointing towards the multiplicities that Meer inhabits in the Urdu ghazal. One of the personas that has recently got a lot of attention is Meer's squareness. So when he talks about the beloved, when he talks about love and passion, oftentimes it is men that he is talking to. He belongs to a group of writers and poets from the 17th and 18th century who were writing verses for people of the same gender and who were very big proponents of what is now referred to by some scholars as poetry of illicit love. Some of the verses from his ghazals that correspond to this and are quite interesting and really capture the playfulness of Meer are as follow, and these are translated versions of them. Your face with the down on it, it is our Quran. What if we kiss it? It is our faith. Finding him inebriated, I pulled him into my arms last night. He said, so you too have become intoxicated tonight. It would be strange if an angel could hold its own. The fairy-faced boys of Delhi are far ahead of them. So he would refer to these fairy-faced boys, these bazaar boys of Delhi, and a lot of his couplets were addressed to them. One of my favorites is, if not him, there is his brother. Meer, are there any restrictions in love? So let's move on to the question of translation. You have translated a lot of work, specifically fiction and nonfiction. You've done some poetry of Fahmida Riaz. And I know that now you are working on a project on Meer. Can you talk about what that process has been like? Who is Meer in translation? What drew you to his work?
So, translating poetry is something that I have stayed away from for the longest time because it is very difficult to do justice by any stretch of the imagination to poetry in translation. And so I stayed away from it until just recently, about 4 years ago, I picked up the work of our famous poet, Fahmida Riaz, the late Fahmida Riaz. And basically, the reason that I took the work up was that I met her. I met her at NYU, and there was something about the way that she read her work that made it seem translatable to me at that time. And so I picked up a collection of her work and started working on it and found that it was not so difficult to do it because most of her work is blank verse or prose poetry and free verse. And and a couple of ghazals, but so I went ahead and did it, and it was very satisfying and it was wonderful. But then I stopped there, and only recently, about a year ago, because I have been attending a session by my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Fran Pritchett, which is called the Ghalib session every Friday, and this has been almost 3 years now. And she is working on Meer and has a project on Meer going. And that sort of introduced me to Meer as something that we can study and look at and translate. And so I also read some translations that she had done and Shamsur Rahman Faruqi had done. And so I thought, well, I was so fascinated by what I was reading that I have never been tempted to translate Ghalib. Of course, I'm not a translator of poetry, but Ghalib has not drawn me to his work the way Meer did in terms of the translation. So I started translating, and I've done some ghazals, and I will read as much as time permits. I will read some, and perhaps some of you who are familiar with Meer's work in Urdu will be able to identify these ghazals. So the first one that I'm going to read is a very popular one, and I will just start with my translation. All remedies came to naught. The medicine proved ineffective. Did you see? In the end, this sickness of the heart did me in. The period of youth was spent weeping. In old age, we shut our eyes. That is, we spent many nights staying awake and rested when it was morning. There is no fault in her letting me live. It is my good fortune. The first message she sent us was the message of death. We helpless ones have been accused unjustly of having freedom. They are the ones who do what they want and wrongly give us a bad name. So one of the things I'm sure all of you know here, those of you who are familiar with Urdu literature, that a ghazal is very rarely a continued idea in its entirety. So each couplet generally deals with a different idea. So there's no continuity in terms of theme or meaning. The drunk debauchees of the world all bow down before you all the time. They have made you the imam of all the foppish, crooked, perverse, jaunty ones. Even in a state of passion, we have not shown any disrespect. We went for miles in her direction, but offered prostrations at every step. Whose Kaaba? What Qibla? What is sacred? What the Hajj garment? This is the place here from which the inhabitants of her street offered salutations. The Sheikh, who is naked in the mosque, was in the wine house last night. The cloak, the religious habit, kurta, cap, he gave all away as rewards in a state of intoxication. If only she would lift the veil from her face. Otherwise, what is the use if she lets everyone gaze at her after I shut my eyes in death? In this realm of all that is, the only thing we can interfere with is weeping all night until day breaks, or somehow going through the day until evening falls. By chance, the need for air had brought her out in the garden. With her face, she conquered the rose and enslaved the cypress with her height. Held both her silvery wrists in my hand and then let them go, misinterpreted her vows and promises, alas, was misled by my thoughts. All tasks have become worthless because of the baseness of each moment. She expressed contempt 4 times over with every entreaty I made. It was difficult to get rid of the restlessness of the gazelle in flight. Those who tamed you must have used magic or performed a miracle. Why do you now ask about Meer's religion and faith? For he made the sandal mark on his forehead, settled in the temple, and gave up Islam ages ago. This is another one. Just look, where does it rise? From the heart or from the soul? Some kind of smoke, where does it rise from? Look to the dwelling, flaming splendor of the voice. There is some kind of smoke arising from the nest. Where will he find another place to sit, the one who rises from your threshold? In such a manner we rose from the street. Ah, it was like someone rising from this world. And this third one. My existence is like a bubble. This spectacle is like a mirage. What to say of the daintiness of her lip? It is like the petal of a rose. Open the eyes of your heart also on this world. The form it has is like a dream. Again and again I go to her door. My condition now is one of agitation. When I spoke, she said, "This voice belongs to that miserable one." Meer, in those half-shut eyes, all the intoxication is like that of wine. I think we have time for one more, right? I came like a beggar, called out, departed. Faqirana aaye sada kar chale, ki miyan khush raho, hum dua kar chale. I came like a beggar, called out, departed. Young man, remain happy is my blessing. I depart. What was that thing, for which I surrendered all that was in my heart? I depart. I had longed so to be on your street. In the end, I was bathed here in blood. I depart. Such is the way you appeared to me. It made me lose myself. You made me become separated from myself as you depart. My forehead has been lost in my prostrations. I have fulfilled the duty of worship. I depart. I have worshipped you until, O idol, I turned you into God in everyone's eyes as I depart. What will I say if someone asks, O Meer, you came to this world, what did you accomplish now that you depart?
Thank you so much for sharing his work with all of us. Thank you everyone for listening. I just want to remind everyone that why Meer is so contemporarily important. He is remembered in qawwalis, in his poetry. He also had a movie made after him a couple of years ago in 2016, Mahi Meer, where the protagonist is in conversation with Meer's work and is kind of grappling with his life and thinking about how Meer could be used in that way. Hopefully we in our lives as protagonists can also take things away from Meer, and also, hopefully, we get to see the project that you are working with your ghazal group, and we get to read Meer in translation. Thank you, Meer. Thank you, Meer.